The water was rising. Captain George Martelli stood at the edge of the Wadi, watching the muddy torrent swallow the desert floor. Behind him, 480 exhausted British soldiers huddled on the wrong side of what had been, just hours ago, a dry riverbed. Now it was a raging barrier between them and survival. It was February 1941, and the war in East Africa was reaching its breaking point. Mussolini's forces controlled the region, and the British were pushing north through Italian Somaliland toward Ethiopia. But nature had other plans. The seasonal rains had come early, transforming ancient wadis into impassable rivers overnight. Martelli had been a civil engineer before the war, building roads across the British Empire. He understood load calculations, stress points, and the unforgiving mathematics of bridge construction. He also understood that what his commanding officer was asking was impossible. "We need a bridge, Captain. By morning. No timber, no steel, no concrete. Just a handful of Royal Engineers, a motley collection of local laborers, and whatever scraps they could scavenge from the desert." The nearest proper bridge materials were 3 days away. 3 days these men didn't have. Enemy patrols were closing in, and the water was still rising. Then one of the African porters stepped forward. His name was Kofi Mensah, a quiet man from the Gold Coast who had been hauling supplies for the British column. He'd said little during the campaign, but now he spoke with quiet confidence. "I can build your bridge, sir." Martelli looked at him skeptically. The man had no engineering credentials, no formal training. Just calloused hands and an unwavering gaze. "With what?" Martelli asked. Mensah smiled slightly. "With what the desert gives us." The story of Kofi Mensah's bridge has been largely forgotten by history, buried in the dusty archives of British East Africa Command records and the fading memories of a war that, for most, ended in Europe. Yet what happened over those 36 hours in February 1941 represents one of the most remarkable feats of improvised engineering in military history, and a testament to the ingenuity that emerges when desperation meets determination. The East African Campaign of World War II remains one of the conflict's lesser-known theaters. While the world's attention focused on the Blitzkrieg across Europe and the Battle of Britain, a different war raged across the Horn of Africa. Italian forces, having invaded British Somaliland and parts of Kenya and Sudan, controlled a vast territory. The British response was a multi-pronged assault pushing north and west, employing a diverse force that included British regulars, Indian Army units, South African brigades, and West African soldiers and laborers. Among these were men like Kofi Mensah, recruited from the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, as part of the Royal West African Frontier Force support units. These men served primarily as porters, drivers, and laborers, the unglamorous but essential backbone of any military campaign. They were rarely mentioned in dispatches, seldom decorated, and almost never credited with the strategic victories they helped secure. The Wadi that would become the site of Mensah's bridge lay somewhere in the Ogaden region, the exact location lost to incomplete wartime records. What we know comes from Captain Martelli's personal diary, recovered decades later, and from interviews conducted with 3 surviving soldiers in the 1980s. Their accounts tell of a crisis that seemed insurmountable and a solution that seemed to defy physics itself. This is their story, a story of innovation born from necessity, of traditional knowledge meeting modern warfare, and of one man's quiet genius that saved hundreds of lives and changed the course of a forgotten campaign. The British column had been on the move for 6 days, pushing through the semi-arid scrubland of Italian Somaliland with orders to reach the strategic town of Jijiga before Italian reinforcements could arrive. Major William Thornton commanded the mixed unit of 480 men, 2 companies of the King's African Rifles, a platoon of Royal Engineers supporting artillery crews, and approximately 80 West African porters and support personnel. The intelligence had been clear: minimal resistance expected, favorable weather conditions, and straightforward terrain. But military intelligence, as soldiers often joked, was frequently neither military nor intelligent. The first indication of trouble came on the evening of February 14th, when scouts reported Italian spotter planes circling overhead. The column had been spotted, which meant the enemy now knew their position, strength, and likely destination. Major Thornton made the decision to accelerate their march, hoping to reach Jijiga before the Italians could organize a proper defense or worse, an ambush. They pressed through the night, exhausted men stumbling over rocks and thorny scrub in the darkness. By dawn on February 15th, They had covered nearly 30 miles and were approaching a series of wadis that, according to their maps, would be dry and easily crossed. The rainy season wasn't supposed to begin for another 3 weeks. Nature, however, follows no military timetable. Sergeant James Mackenzie, leading the advance scouts, was the first to hear it, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. He'd grown up in the Scottish Highlands and knew the sound of fast-moving water. He raised his hand to halt the column and climbed a small rise to get a better view. What he saw made his blood run cold. The wadi ahead, which should have been a dry depression easily forded, had transformed into a churning brown river at least 50 yards wide. The water level was still rising, fed by flash floods from storms in the distant highlands. Debris tumbled in the current, uprooted bushes, the carcass of a dead goat, even what appeared to be parts of an abandoned truck. Mackenzie scrambled back to report to Major Thornton, who immediately ordered a halt and moved forward to assess the situation himself. Captain Martelli accompanied him, along with Lieutenant Davies, the senior engineering officer. The 3 men stood at the wadi's edge, watching the water surge past. Martelli knelt and picked up a stick, tossing it into the current. It disappeared immediately, swept away by the violent flow. "How deep?" Thornton asked. 8 feet in the center, maybe 10, Martelli estimated. "Current's too strong to ford, even with vehicles. We'd lose equipment, probably lose men. Can we wait it out?" Davies shook his head. "Flash floods like this can last days. And the water's still rising, which means the storms upstream haven't finished yet." Thornton pulled out his map, studying it with increasing frustration. "Alternate routes? The next crossing point is 40 miles northeast," Martelli said. "But that takes us directly toward the Italian garrison at Dagobah. We'd be walking into their guns. And going back, we passed another wadi 12 miles back. If this one's flooded, that one probably is too. We'd be trapped between 2 rivers." As if to emphasize their predicament, the sound of airplane engines drifted across the morning air. The Italian spotters were back, circling lazily overhead, observing. They knew the British were stuck. Thornton made a quick decision. "Get the men into defensive positions on this side of the wadi. Dig in. Martelli, Davies, I need options. We can't stay here, and we can't go around. That leaves through." "Sir, with respect, there is no through," Davies protested. "Not without proper bridging equipment, which we don't have." "Then improvise something. You're engineers, aren't you?" The dismissal was clear. Martelli and Davies withdrew to begin the impossible task they'd been assigned. As they walked back toward the column, Davies muttered, "Build a bridge. With what? Good intentions and army rations." Martelli didn't answer. He was already running calculations in his head, inventorying their resources. 2 Bedford trucks, several fuel drums, some rope, standard engineering tools, and about 30 able-bodied engineers. It wasn't nearly enough. But as he'd learned in his years building infrastructure across Africa, the first rule of frontier engineering was simple. Use what you have, not what you wish you had. What he didn't yet know was that the solution would come not from his years of formal training, but from the wisdom of a man who'd grown up learning to read the land in ways no engineering school could teach. Kofi Mensah had been watching the British officers with quiet interest. He'd learned, over his months with the column, to read the body language of anxious white men. The stiff shoulders, the quick gestures, the way they kept looking at the water as if staring at it could make it disappear. These were signs of men facing a problem they didn't know how to solve. Mensah was 32 years old, though the British record-keepers had guessed wrong and listed him as 26. He'd been born in a small village near Kumasi in the Gold Coast, the son of a bridge builder, though not the kind the British would recognize. His father, Kwame, had been a master of traditional Ashanti bridge construction, knowledge passed down through generations. In the forests of the Gold Coast, where rivers swelled violently during the rainy season, the Ashanti people had developed sophisticated methods of creating temporary crossings using vines, bamboo, and an intimate understanding of water dynamics and structural tension. Kwame had built more than 30 such bridges in his lifetime, and he'd taught his son everything he knew. When the war came and the British began recruiting laborers for the East African campaign, Mensah had volunteered, partly for the pay, partly for adventure, and partly because he was curious about the wider world beyond his village. The work was hard, endless marching, carrying heavy loads, following orders he didn't always understand in a language he'd had to learn quickly. But he was strong and capable, and he'd earned the respect of his fellow West African porters. Now, watching the British officers stare helplessly at the flooded Wadi, Mensa recognized something familiar. The problem wasn't the water itself. Water was predictable, constant. The problem was that these men were trying to fight the water instead of working with it. He turned to his friend Kwame Osei, no relation to his father, though they shared the common name. They need a bridge, Mensa said in Twi. The white men have no wood, Osei replied. No steel beams. They have nothing. They have everything, Mensa corrected. They just don't know how to see it. He stood and walked toward where Captain Martelli was examining the Wadi's banks, making notes in a small book. Mensa waited politely until the officer noticed him. Yes, Martelli said, distracted. Sir, I can help with the bridge. Martelli looked up, really seeing Mensa for the first time. He saw a tall man with powerful shoulders, wearing the worn uniform of a West African porter. The officer's instinctive reaction was dismissal. What could a porter know about engineering? But something in Mensa's calm confidence made him pause. You know something about bridges? Yes, sir. My father was a bridge builder in the Gold Coast. I have built many bridges. Martelli's skepticism was evident. With what materials? We have no proper timber, no steel, no concrete. We have rope and some fuel drums, and whatever we can salvage from the trucks if we're desperate enough to cannibalize them. In my home, we build bridges with vines and bamboo, Mensa explained. We use the strength of the water, not fight against it. We use what the land gives us. There's no bamboo in the desert, Martelli pointed out. No, Mensa agreed. But there are other things. The acacia trees have strong, flexible branches. There are stones in the Wadi bed. There are the... He paused, searching for the English word, then gave up and used the Twi term. The dum palms, the desert palms. Very strong fibers. Martelli closed his notebook. Despite his better judgment, he was intrigued. Show me what you mean. Mensa led him along the Wadi's edge, pointing out features that Martelli had overlooked. Here, a stand of acacia trees with branches that could be harvested. There, exposed rock formations in the Wadi bed that could serve as natural pilings if properly utilized. Further downstream, a grove of dum palms whose fibrous fronds could be woven into rope far stronger than it appeared. The traditional bridge in my country uses what we call living tension, Mensa explained, his English improving as he warmed to the subject. The bridge moves with the water, not against it. It bends but does not break. The more the water pushes, the stronger the tension becomes. He knelt and drew in the sand, sketching a design that looked nothing like any bridge Martelli had seen before. It wasn't a rigid structure with fixed supports. It was a suspended, flexible crossing that would ride on top of the water's force rather than trying to resist it. This is a suspension bridge, Martelli said, recognizing the basic principle even if the execution was unfamiliar. Yes, but different. We make the river work for us. See here. Mensa drew anchor points on both banks. We dig deep holes, fill them with stones and the heaviest things we have. Then we stretch the main cables. We don't have steel cables, Martelli interrupted. We make them. The dum palm fibers, twisted together many times, become as strong as your cables. My father's bridges held 50 men at once. I have seen them hold water buffalo. Martelli stared at the drawing, his engineering mind racing through the physics. The principle was sound. Suspension bridges distributed weight along their entire length, and if Mensa was right about the fiber strength. But there were so many variables, so many things that could go wrong. How long would it take to build? Mensa looked at the sky, calculating. With many hands helping, and if we work through the night, by tomorrow afternoon perhaps. Major Thornton wants it by morning. Then it cannot be done by morning, Mensa said simply. A bridge built too fast will kill the men who use it. Better to build it right. There was no arrogance in his words, just plain fact. Martelli found himself respecting the man's directness. Wait here, Martelli said. He needed to speak with Major Thornton. Major Thornton listened to Martelli's proposal with growing incredulity. A bridge made of palm fibers and desert wood, designed by an African porter with no formal engineering credentials, using principles from some tribal tradition in West Africa. It sounded like desperation masquerading as a plan. But desperation, Thornton reflected, was exactly what they had. The Italian planes had made 3 more passes, low enough that they could see the observers photographing their position. Radio intercepts suggested enemy forces were mobilizing. The nearest friendly units were days away. And the water was still rising. The Wadi was now nearly 60 yards wide. You trust this man? Thornton asked Martelli. I trust the physics, sir. And I trust that his people have been building bridges in difficult conditions for a lot longer than we've been telling them how to do it. Thornton made his decision. You have until tomorrow evening. That's the absolute limit. After that, we'll have to attempt a forced march back the way we came and hope we can break through any Italian forces we encounter. Get everyone you need. Strip whatever materials you must. But understand, Captain, if this fails, we're out of options. Understood, sir. Within an hour, a transformation swept through the British column. What had been a dispirited, trapped force became a hive of focused activity. Mensa organized the West African porters into work crews, each with specific tasks. He spoke to them in Twi, explaining the design, demonstrating techniques, drawing on their collective knowledge of traditional construction methods. The British engineers, initially skeptical, found themselves taking direction from Mensa, a reversal of the usual colonial hierarchy that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But crisis has a way of stripping away social pretenses. Sergeant Mackenzie, watching a porter named Yaw demonstrate how to properly splice palm fibers, muttered to Martelli, "Maybe we should have been asking these fellows for advice all along." The first task was harvesting materials. Teams moved out with machetes and saws, cutting acacia branches with the right combination of strength and flexibility. Other groups collected dum palm fronds, which Mensa inspected carefully, rejecting those that were too young or too dry. The best fibers came from mature palms that still retained some moisture. They were tougher and more resilient. Like my grandmother's rope, one of the Gold Coast porters explained to a confused British corporal. You want the fiber that bends before it breaks. Meanwhile, another crew worked on the anchor points. Mensa had selected locations on both banks where the ground was rocky rather than sandy. They dug pits 6 feet deep and 4 feet across, breaking through the hard surface to reach more stable earth below. Into these pits they loaded the heaviest materials available. Engine blocks from the trucks, fuel drums filled with rocks, artillery shells, carefully disarmed, and layer upon layer of stones hauled up from the Wadi bed. The physical labor was punishing. Men worked in shifts under the brutal afternoon sun, their uniforms soaked with sweat. The West African porters, more accustomed to the heat, set a pace that the British soldiers struggled to match. Lieutenant Davies, stripped to his undershirt and working alongside the men, admitted to Martelli, "I haven't worked this hard since basic training. These chaps make it look easy." As sunset approached, the most delicate work began, creating the main suspension cables. Mensa supervised this personally, teaching the technique to British and African workers alike. The dum palm fibers were stripped, cleaned, and then woven together in a specific pattern, not simply twisted, but braided in a complex interlocking weave that distributed stress evenly. Each fiber is weak alone, Mensa explained, demonstrating the technique. But together, woven properly, they become strong, like soldiers in formation. Private Thomas Richardson, a former textile worker from Lancashire, watched the process with professional interest. It's like rope making, but different. The twist pattern, it's bloody clever, actually. As you load it, the weave tightens, gets stronger. Yes, Mensa confirmed. The weight makes it better, not worse. They worked through the night by lamplight, creating 4 main cables, each as thick as a man's wrist and over 70 yards long. Testing them required creativity. They draped one cable between 2 trees and had progressively more men hang from it until 8 soldiers were suspended without the cable showing signs of stress. How much weight will it hold? Davies asked. Mensa calculated in his head. If we use 4 cables and distribute the load properly, perhaps 60 men at a time. But we will not test that. Better to send them across in small groups. By dawn, exhausted men had made remarkable progress, but the bridge was far from complete. The anchor points were set, the main cables ready, but the crucial deck structure remained. This was the most technically challenging part, creating a stable walking surface that would flex with the water's movement without dumping men into the torrent. Mensa's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Using the acacia branches, they created a lattice framework, each piece lashed to the others and to the main cables with smaller fiber ropes. The lattice wasn't solid, there were gaps between branches, but this was intentional. The gaps allowed water to flow through if waves splashed onto the deck, preventing the structure from acting like a sail that the current could tear away. It's more like a net than a bridge, Mackenzie observed. Yes, Mensa agreed. The water passes through. The bridge stays. On the far bank, A smaller team worked under Corporal Anderson to prepare the receiving end. They'd managed to get across earlier by swimming with ropes during a brief lull when the water temporarily receded, a dangerous operation that nearly claimed one man's life. Now they were setting up the anchor points on that side, communicating with the main group through flag signals. Major Thornton checked his watch constantly. Italian reconnaissance planes had appeared twice during the night. Contact with the enemy was inevitable. The only question was when. By mid-afternoon on February 16th, 36 hours after the crisis began, the bridge was ready for testing. Mensah walked out onto it first, moving slowly, testing each section. The structure swayed and bounced with his movement, but held firm. He reached the center, where the water roiled below him, and jumped up and down several times. The British soldiers watching from shore held their collective breath. The bridge absorbed the shock, the lattice deck flexing and then settling. Mensah waved from the center and continued to the far bank. A cheer erupted from the men. "All right," Major Thornton called out. "Let's get this column moving. Light equipment first, then the men in groups of 10. Heavy weapons and vehicles will have to leave behind or dismantle and carry across piece by piece." Captain Martelli approached Mensah, who had returned across the bridge. "That was either very brave or very foolish." Mensah smiled. "My father always said, never ask a man to trust a bridge you would not trust yourself. I trust the bridge." "So do I," Martelli said. And he meant it. The evacuation began immediately, organized with military precision but executed with careful caution. Each group of 10 men was spaced out across the bridge's length, preventing concentrated weight that might overstress the structure. The first groups crossed slowly, uncertain, gripping the guide ropes that ran along both sides of the deck. Private Richardson was in the second group. He wrote in his diary that night, "Walking across Mensah's bridge was like walking across a living thing. It moved under your feet, swayed with the wind, bounced with each step. You could feel the water's power beneath you, trying to reach up and grab you. But the bloody thing held. Damned if it didn't hold." The light equipment came next: rifles, ammunition, personal packs, radios. Everything that could be carried by hand. The men formed a human chain, passing materials across in a steady stream. The bridge's flexibility, which had seemed like a weakness, proved to be its strength. When a strong gust of wind hit, or when the current surged beneath, the structure simply swayed and absorbed the force rather than resisting it. The heavy weapons posed a greater challenge. The artillery pieces were too heavy to risk on the bridge, and Thornton made the difficult decision to spike the guns and push them into the Wadi, denying them to the enemy. The trucks were partially disassembled, with engines, axles, and other valuable parts carried across by hand. It was painstaking work, and every hour that passed increased the risk of Italian attack. Lieutenant Davies supervised the transfer of explosives and ammunition, the most dangerous cargo. He developed a grudging respect for the bridge's design and for Mensah himself. "In 20 years of engineering," he told Martelli, "I've never seen anyone think as practically as that man. He doesn't just solve problems, he sees them from angles we're trained to ignore." By late afternoon, 3/4 of the column had crossed successfully. That's when the Italians finally arrived. A motorized patrol, 3 trucks and perhaps 40 men, appeared on the ridge overlooking the Wadi. They'd clearly expected to find the British trapped and demoralized. Instead, they found an enemy actively escaping. The Italian commander, to his credit, reacted quickly. Machine gun fire raked the near bank, sending men diving for cover. But the angle was wrong. The ridge was too high and too far, and most of the shots went wide. The real danger was if the Italians brought up mortars, or if they attempted to descend and attack the crossing point directly. Major Thornton organized a defensive line on the near bank, using their remaining machine guns to return fire and keep the Italians pinned on the ridge. "Keep moving," he shouted to the men waiting to cross. "Don't bunch up. Small groups, just like before." The next hour was chaos, a running battle as the British tried to complete their evacuation while the Italians probed for weaknesses in their perimeter. Men crossed the bridge while bullets whined overhead. Mackenzie, commanding the rear guard, held his position with 20 men, covering the final crossings. Mensah remained on the near bank, refusing to cross until all the British soldiers were safe. He'd reinforced sections of the bridge that showed stress, tightening lashings and replacing a cracked acacia branch. Martelli stayed with him, the 2 men working while combat raged around them. "You should go," Martelli told him. "Your job's done. The bridge is built. The bridge must be maintained, Mensa replied calmly, adjusting a rope, until the last man crosses. The Italians finally brought up a mortar, and the first shell exploded 50 yards from the crossing point, sending up a geyser of sand and rock. Thornton, now on the far bank, realized they were out of time. Everyone across now. Mackenzie, pull back. The final group sprinted for the bridge. Mackenzie's rearguard fell back in good order, firing as they moved. The Italians, sensing the British were escaping, charged down from the ridge. Go! Martelli pushed Mensa toward the bridge. The two men ran, joining the last of the rearguard. Behind them, Italian soldiers were less than 200 yards away and closing fast. They pounded across the swaying structure, the bridge bouncing violently under their running feet. Bullets struck the water around them, sending up small splashes. One shot hit an acacia branch in the deck, but the lattice structure held. Mackenzie was the last man across. As his boots touched the far bank, he pulled out his knife and looked at Major Thornton. Sir. Thornton hesitated only a moment. The bridge had saved them, but they couldn't leave it intact for the enemy to use. Cut it down, Sergeant. Mackenzie slashed through the guide ropes on the far side. On the near bank, the Italians had reached the crossing point and were starting across. The bridge, now unsecured on one end, immediately began to sag. The lead Italian soldier, realizing what was happening, tried to scramble back, but physics was unforgiving. The deck tilted sharply. The Italian soldier lost his footing and plunged into the torrent, followed by two of his comrades who'd ventured onto the unstable structure. The current swept them away immediately, their screams lost in the water's roar. The remaining Italians retreated to the near bank and opened fire, but the British were already moving, disappearing into the scrubland on the far side. The pursuit was over. The Wadi, which had trapped the British, now protected them. That evening, the column made camp 6 miles from the crossing point. Major Thornton tallied his forces. 480 men had entered the crisis, 478 had emerged. The 2 losses had occurred earlier in the campaign and weren't related to the crossing itself. Every man who'd been trapped by the flooded Wadi had made it across safely. It was by any measure a remarkable success. Thornton found Mensa sitting apart from the others, staring at a small fire. The major sat down beside him. You saved this column, you know, Thornton said. Without your bridge, we'd be dead or prisoners. Mensa shrugged slightly. I built what my father taught me to build. Any bridge builder from my village could have done the same. But they weren't here. You were. Thornton pulled out a small notebook and wrote briefly. He tore out the page and handed it to Mensa. I'm recommending you for recognition. I know the Army doesn't usually doesn't usually recognize support personnel. But this was exceptional. Mensa accepted the paper but didn't read it. Thank you, sir. But the bridge was not built by me alone. The men who helped will all be noted, Thornton assured him. But it was your knowledge, your design, your leadership. Take credit when credit is due, man. After Thornton left, Martelli approached. He sat down without asking permission, in the easy familiarity that shared danger creates. I've been thinking, Martelli said. After the war, I'm supposed to go back to building roads and bridges across Africa. Colonial infrastructure projects. The usual thing. Yes, sir. Seems to me we've been building the wrong bridges. Or rather, we've been building them the wrong way. Importing European methods, European materials, European thinking. Ignoring centuries of local knowledge. Mensa poked at the fire with a stick. My father used to say, the land tells you what it needs. You must only listen. Wise man, your father. Martelli paused. When this is over, would you consider working with me? Teaching me, really. Teaching us how to build bridges that belong to Africa, not just on it. Mensa looked at him, surprised. In the colonial hierarchy, white officers didn't ask African porters for teaching partnerships. I would like that, sir. But I think there will be many changes before such things are possible. Changes are coming, Martelli agreed. This war is changing everything. After what I've seen these past 2 days, after what you've shown me, he shook his head. We've been bloody fools, haven't we? Thinking we knew everything, ignoring wisdom that was right in front of us. Not fools, sir. Just looking at the world from one direction only. Sometimes you must look from a different angle to see clearly. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire burn down while around them. Exhausted soldiers slept the deep sleep of men who'd survived what seemed impossible. The war in East Africa would continue for several more months. The British would eventually triumph, pushing the Italians out of Ethiopia and Somaliland. Most of the men who crossed Mensa's bridge would survive to see victory, though some would not. But on this night, in this moment, they were simply grateful to be alive, to have crossed the uncrossable, to have been saved by ingenuity, improvisation, and the quiet genius of a man who knew how to listen to what the land was telling him. History has a way of forgetting the contributions that don't fit comfortable narratives. The East African campaign was won by brave soldiers, brilliant generals, superior logistics. These are the stories that fill the official accounts. The story of Kofi Mensa's bridge appears in only 3 documents: Captain Martelli's personal diary, Major Thornton's after-action report, where Mensa is mentioned only as a native engineer whose assistance proved invaluable, and a brief mention in the regimental history of the King's African Rifles. Mensa never received his decoration. The recommendation was filed, lost in the bureaucratic chaos of war, and never acted upon. After the war, he returned to the Gold Coast and resumed his life, building traditional bridges in his home region until his death in 1978. The British Empire he'd served would dissolve, and his homeland would become the independent nation of Ghana in 1957. Captain Martelli kept his promise. After the war, he remained in Africa and pioneered new approaches to infrastructure development that incorporated indigenous engineering knowledge. He credited Mensa in several technical papers, though few in the European engineering establishment paid attention. The two men corresponded occasionally until Mensa's death, a friendship maintained across the boundaries of race and class that the colonial world tried to enforce. The bridge itself lasted only minutes after the British crossed, destroyed to prevent enemy use. But its legacy endured in the 478 lives it saved, in the lessons it taught about the value of local wisdom, and in the small ways it changed how some engineers thought about their craft. Today, scholars of African military history are beginning to recover these forgotten stories, piecing together the contributions of the thousands of African soldiers and support personnel whose names never made it into the history books. Mensa's Bridge is now taught as a case study at the University of Ghana's Engineering School, a reminder that innovation comes from unexpected places and that true engineering wisdom lies not just in formal training, but in understanding the land, listening to experience, and having the humility to learn from those whose knowledge comes from different sources. The Wadi has long since returned to being an unremarkable dry riverbed, indistinguishable from 1,000 others scattered across the Horn of Africa. But for one brief moment in February 1941, it was the site of something remarkable. A bridge that shouldn't have worked, built by a man who supposedly lacked the credentials to design it, saving lives that history barely remembers. Sometimes the impossible is simply the possible seen from a different angle. Tentar novamente.